Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Presidents, Prime Ministers, Chancellor, please join us at the table. We would like to start. I was requested to manage this panel and to exactly keep the time. So I request each speaker not to exceed 15 minutes in the basic presentations so that we have some time to discuss, and allow me at the end to give me 5 to 8 minutes to do the summary. So let's proceed according to the list of the speakers put forward by the organizer, and I kindly ask Csaba Korosi, President of the 77th session of the United Nations Assembly, to start. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in those 15 minutes, Mike should be, is it on? So in those 15 minutes, I try to offer you some re-evaluation of some of the challenges and crises we are having related to SDGs and the sustainable transformation. That could help us answering a little bit better the questions of how to finance, what to finance, and who should finance it. Let's be quite frank, we have a major credibility problem today. Halfway through of the implementation period of the SDGs, the success of reaching the desired result might be there at 12 to 15% of the targets. And we are over 50% of the period. So you may ask, or anybody from our citizens may ask, that fine, the first half of the period is over, the second half is coming, what has changed? Why should I believe that the second half of the implementation period will be more target-oriented, more successful, and more purposeful? My second point is that we have a misperception that we have the goals, we have the roadmap, we have the implementation plan, we are just not doing it. Quite frankly, the SDGs and Agenda 2030 was a global vision. We never had an implementation plan. We never had a particular implementation plan designed for each and every country. We were, when we designed the SDGs, we were on the conviction that the implementation plans will be developed by each and every country, each and every region, and it will be done according to the traditions, abilities, priorities, and possibilities of the given country, community, of the region. In most cases, it has not been done. The third, there is no agreed methodology yet of how to measure progress. We measure certain standalone parameters. We measure many standalone items by indicators. But if I ask you, can you give me the answer whether we are making progress on transformation? The honest answer is we don't know. Because we know a lot of details, but we don't see the system and we don't see the change of the system because we haven't created the system of measuring transformation. When we operate in our countries, in our regions, we all the time impact 5 types of capitals: human capital, social capital, natural capital, built capital, infrastructure, and financial capital, and we interchange them into one into another. we can relatively well measure how that interchange is going on from one to another, but we don't know the balance because we have no system of measuring the balance. Here on the second caveat, that when we do our projects, when we do our investments, we do our policies, during our operations, we create a lot of externalities, positive and negative externalities. My question to you would be, do we really measure all the big externalities that count? Now, unfortunately, we don't. We usually measure those what we deem important from the point of view of our policies. Thus, we create a lot of caveats, a lot of bubbles, with the hope that those bubbles can be left behind and they will just stay there for the history. But the truth is that those bubbles tend to burst. Those bubbles, those debts, be them financial debts, be them social debts, demographic debts, debts in terms of natural capital, they will have to be paid by someone. If not by us, then by our children, or by another country, by another community. So as long as we don't have this methodology of how our actions are actually supporting or not supporting the sustainability transformation we agreed, our actions will not be as efficient as we would like to. It's interesting, in the goal 17, target 19, we created this expectation. It is called going beyond GDP. So it means that we expected at that time that the international community, with the science community in its forefront, will create the new methodology. But we still don't have it. We discussed it many times with SG Guterres. And he said first that, okay, fine, we can have it around 25, 26. And I told him that we are now getting prepared for an SDG summit. Do you think it will be credible if we say that, well, we are halfway through, but we still don't have the real methodology? And now, as a compromise, we agreed that this methodology should be created by the Summit of the Future. Now, as I see the preparations in New York and in some other platforms, this methodology will not be ready by September 2024. If we are lucky, there might be a marching order by September of this year to develop this methodology. In some other platforms, we are trying to work on it because it's absolutely essential that we understand what we measure, what we invest, what we do, what we impact, and what is the outcome. Another factor related to our difference between our expectations and the reality, how to finance it. And now let's put into brackets that if we don't measure, it's very difficult to predict finances. How to finance it. Again, a perceptional problem. In many countries, many communities, financing SDGs is perceived as something we do at the business as usual, and we get some extra money on the top of our usual budget, and that will make the trick. That will make the transformation gradually, but it will make our budget and economies and social structures working in different way. Unfortunately, it is not going to work. If we mean transformation, the transformation should go into our core budget as well. If we really want to change the conditions of our life, well-being, the integrated approach, how we would like to design future, the whole of the budget should reflect on that. Since there is no real agreement on that, how to do it, another problem is affecting our discourses. As we heard in the opening panel, there is a very deep-going geopolitical divide in the world, and it may go even deeper unless we can stop it. On the other hand, we have a different type of crisis at hand. These crises are the cascading crisis stemming from the non-sustainable way of our operations. The novelty of our time, of our day, is that these two types of crises started interacting and creating a new situation. When Russia is invading Ukraine and changing the conditions of the food market in the world, because of the war in Ukraine, famine comes in Africa. The similar very close interlinkages you can detect in the case of water crisis, in the case of energy, and in the case of biodiversity as well. So my first motion would be, should we be able by September to state that we have to separate as much as we can the crises and the crisis management related to the global common goods, and leaving it separate from the geopolitical rivalry. I know it sounds a little bit naive. I know it is a very, very complicated issue, but why would it be so important? The geopolitical conflicts are usually guided and governed by a zero-sum logic. It's a zero-sum game. The managing the crisis in the field of the global common goods requires global cooperation. If the zero-sum game logic is overwriting our actions related to the global common goods, then the result is not another zero-sum game, but it's a negative-sum game. And that's what is happening today. So therefore, as fast as we can, we should try separate the two. The third, finances. You may know that in some areas, we have international agreements of allocating financial responsibilities. It is mostly biodiversity and climate. And there's a famous acronym CBDR, Common but Differentiated Responsibility, which indicates that those who contributed to the development of the crisis should contribute to the financial solution deeper and to a larger extent. But there is no such an agreement for making the sustainability transformation. And while in our own countries, we have the system of how to reallocate resources, it's a taxation system, it's social policies, we don't have the system at the international scale. So we either think of how to create it, how to improve it, or we have to come back to see how we can do better in our own region, in our own countries. Last but not least, when we created the SDGs, we calculated that it is going to change the markets. It is the way how to redeveloping the markets. And we calculated that during 15 years, about $90 to $95 trillion of investments will be redirected due to the adherence of the sustainability goals. It is not fresh money. It is mostly the money what we are spending today, just redirected. The fresh part is about 15 to 20 trillion dollars. Now, if we look at who owns that money, governments don't, at least not to the full extent. if we would like to see public budgets to make the trick, then it's mathematically doesn't work. Where is the money? Because money is available in the world. About $400 trillion of private investments are existing in the world. So you may say that, oh, fine, that's great. It's much more than needed, 400 trillion, let's move. But that money is not an uncommitted money, and that money has owners. So what we have to create a system that money and investments will be interested in each and every country to serve better the purposes our societies and our governments agreed upon. So it means that the public money, what we have, may serve as an encouraging, as a de-risking element, and not the one that is making fully the trick.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Korosi. Exactly 15 minutes. What a discipline. If only the financial people would care so
We are in
much
Switzerland,
to
aren't
listen
we?
to. Yeah, but Switzerland is a small country and Geneva is a small place. Yet there are dimensions you just alluded to. So now we have the pleasure to listen to Mr. Hafez Ghanem. He's a regional vice president of the World Bank for Africa, for the Middle East, for different parts in Africa, probably one of the most experienced men overseeing our continent beyond the Mediterranean Sea. You have the floor.
Thank you very, very much. And I'm really happy to be here. It's an honor to speak to this group. And and I'm really grateful to Shaba for making this presentation, because I will start exactly where he stopped. And let me start by giving you a couple of figures. The first figure is the amount of money that is needed according to the independent expert group on climate finance that has worked for the G20, the amount of investment that is needed just to meet the climate goals. And that amount and I'm only talking for developing countries, for the global South, excluding China, and that is $2.4 trillion every year. So $2,400 billion a year. That is what is needed. Now, let me give you another figure, which is how much official development assistance is going to those countries. Actually, if you go to the OECD DAC website, you will think that official development assistance has been stable over the years, and it's around $200 billion a year. That is, but even 200 billion compared to 2.4 trillion is very small. But this number figure hides something, because actually official development assistance has been declining. Out of those 200 billion today, countries are including, in those 200 billion, they're including money that is used for in-country refugees. So, and that adds up to about $30 billion. They include support to Ukraine in its war defending against Russia, and that is about $15 billion. So in fact, official development assistance going to the global South, which was around 200 billion, has declined, and it's now more like 150 billion. Third figure I would like to give you is on debt. Today, half of the poorest countries in the world are either in debt distress or are at a high risk of debt distress. So we have a situation where the needs just to meet the climate, I'm not even talking about the other SDGs, is 2,400 billion. Support in terms of official development assistance is coming down, and it's only around 150 billion. And at the same time, the countries have to pay out a lot in terms of debt service. Debt service now in many countries, as we heard this morning, is higher than the budgets for education and health put together. The G20 had put in place this common framework to deal with the debt service. It's not working. And it's not working. I don't have time to go into the details, but it's for the reasons that we heard this morning, because you cannot get China and the Paris Club to agree. You cannot get the bondholders and the commercial banks to agree. It's a major issue of, so out of the 37 countries who are eligible for debt treatment under the common framework, only 4 have even started the process. The others don't feel it's worth their time. So this is the situation, and that is why Chaba's points about we are not where we want to be, that we have a major credibility problem. He's absolutely right. That's where the major credibility problem is coming from. Now, in preparation for the Summit for the Future, the United Nations, the Secretary General, has come up with a report called Our Common Agenda, which I had the pleasure of reading and studying in detail. I would really recommend most of you to take a look at it. And under the part on the financing, the report makes very strong statements and very good statements about reducing debt risks and enhancing sovereign debt markets, on finding a resolution for the current debt crisis. It talks about massively increasing climate financing, massively increasing support to countries for the SDGs. Those are all great recommendations and things that should be done. I would like to add, in the very short time I have, 6 points actually that really we need to look at, and that come out from the questions that are there. The first 2 points are about dealing with the debt crisis. Unless we deal, if countries are going to be paying out more debt service than their health and education budgets, will never reach the SDGs. So you need to deal with the debt crisis. And today we have a big problem, is that nearly half of the debt of the developing countries is held by bondholders. So how to negotiate with the different bondholders is a big problem. So my first point is that we need to think about a special deal for bondholders. And that is something similar to what was done in the 1980s under what is called the Brady Plan, where you actually exchange bonds that are at a high interest rate but are at a high risk of not being repaid, by bonds with a lower interest rate but with a guarantee from a big power or from an international organization. The second suggestion I would like to make, other than the how to deal with the debt on the bondholders, is to put in place a system for debt for climate swaps, similar to what in the 1980s and so the last century, dealing with the last debt crisis in the last century, we put in place something called the HIPEX, High Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. Under that HIPEX, we agreed to reduce the debt of the poor countries in return for them investing in poverty reduction plans. And we asked the World Bank and the IMF to monitor that. I suggest that now that we are in the same situation, and we can go into a discussion of why are we in the same situation, we need to have something like the HIPEX, but where the agreement with the debtor country is to use that money for climate investments. It would be win-win. because we would reduce the debt, but in return we get investments in a global public good, which is climate. My third point is on the financing of climate, and it also comes from a point that Chaba was making. I mentioned the $2.4 trillion that is needed in the countries in the South, excluding China, every year for climate investments. Out of those $2.4 trillion, 1.8 trillion is just for energy investments. Another around 300 billion or so is for investments in natural capital, in forests, and so on. And the rest is for adaptation and for loss and damage. Today, there is a lot of pressure to ask World Bank and other and other multilateral development banks to finance climate. What does that mean? First of all, the amounts that they have are very small compared to the needs. Second, it means you want to divert resources that are being used to finance health and education by those development banks and use them to finance climate. Third, it means that you're asking countries who are already poor and highly indebted to borrow to finance a global public good. So I really believe that you should ask the World Bank, the multilateral development banks to finance maybe adaptation, which is a national public good, to finance loss and damage, which is again a national public good, but mitigation, which is the chunk of the $2.4 trillion, which is my old friend and colleague, the late Kamal Dervish, called it the mother of all global public goods, which is climate mitigation. You really need to find a different system. You cannot ask to finance. So my recommendation is to create a separate institution. Let's call it Green Bank, which actually would be reflective of the of today's economy and today's world. So it will go beyond multilateralism of just having country shareholders, but would have countries, private sector, and civil society. It would be a public-private partnership. And because most of the money that is needed to finance climate mitigation, which is in energy and in forestry and so on, can be done by the private sector. So let us create a public-private partnership to finance mitigation and to support the private sector to finance mitigation. I mean, if you've spent many years, as I did, sitting in meetings of the board of directors of the World Bank, and they're wonderful people, but they're not private sector people. So let us get people who, I'll go faster. So that is my third suggestion. My fourth suggestion is that we need to develop the carbon markets. Under the Kyoto protocol, the vision was to create one global carbon market so that a company, say in Latvia, that is facing carbon constraints, can pay a company in South Africa that is doing mitigation and use that credits for its Latvia operations. That has not happened. What has happened is that we now have the biggest carbon market right now is the regional carbon market in Europe. And then we have a bunch of national carbon markets. So I believe that we need to, we have to start with what we have today. And there are suggestions out there of creating what is called a club of carbon markets. How can we link existing carbon markets? And that would be really an important and innovative source of funding for mitigation in the global South. Fifth point is that we're talking always about getting the countries of the North to finance SDGs in the South and so on, and that is good and important, but we also have to get the countries of the South themselves to contribute more. And we need to do much more in terms of domestic resource mobilization in countries of the South, how to support them, both public resource mobilization, taxes and so on, but also private resource mobilization. I worked for 100 years in Africa, in the Middle East and so on, and there are lots of rich private sector capable in those countries, capable of investing. Africa has some very, very active and imaginative entrepreneurs. How can we get those people to invest more? I have some ideas, but I don't think I have time to go into that. The last point I wanted to make is, in addition to domestic resource mobilization, it's not just enough for us. I mean, most of the discussion on the SDGs on climate has been on the quantity of resources, which is, given the huge needs, it makes sense. But let us not forget also the importance of the quality of the use of these resources. If we bring $2.4 trillion today and we throw them and they're misused, that we will not achieve our results. So it is also important to focus on aid effectiveness and on the efficiency of investments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ghanem. You really presented us in 15 minutes, not only a number of figures, but solutions, or way to solutions. Congratulations. We are coming now to the presentation of Mr. Igor Luksic, Prime Minister of Montenegro. Please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. First, for giving me the floor. And I'd like to thank again Nizami for bringing us all together for a very inspiring couple of days of discussions, which are always kind of motivating. And I think including my colleagues, panel speakers, open various aspects to certain topics, which would also like to try to build on, because to some extent it, I think, correlates very much to some of the remarks I wanted to make. At the same time, I have to say that also opening discussions were quite interesting, and discussing where the funds for SDGs should come from, or discussing global governance reform, or anything else which is on this great agenda for 2 days. It's very much intertwined, and all it's interlinked, and it's very hard, I think, to talk about where the funds should come from without struggling into the area of global governance reform, I believe, because I think also even Mr. Ghanem Mr. Ghanem made some points which lead into that direction, because setting up a green bank or working towards new role for the World Bank, it also has to do with global governance reform in a certain way. We also talk about the problem of multilateralism, or the challenges for multilateralism of today's world. But I think we can also trace symptoms of bulging multilateralism. So it's not that it's the lack of multilateralism, it's probably how effective it is. Even the current war in Gaza is trying to be resolved by multilateral efforts of several countries, very much involved in trying to come to the solution. But going back a few weeks ago to COP is multilateral effort, and probably quite effective compared to some of the previous meetings. We'll see what it brings and how results will come off, but at least the effort per se, I think, is quite commendable. We see BRICS being very active over the past years, but we also see G7 kind of rejuvenated. So it seems like that we don't lack multilateralism. It's how effective it is and how successful it's going to be. And not to mention G20, because I think intimately we all think that G20's role probably should be shaped up in the coming years, along with the further reforms in the UN. What we are all unhappy with is how UN reacts to the problems of peace and security, and what should be done to be more effective there. Because talking about SDGs or climate change and so on, I think world is altogether quite aware of the problem and trying to fix it. We may be happy or unhappy with the pace of it, but I think there is overwhelming understanding that we need to go into a new direction. And interestingly enough, I think climate change discussions have become a kind of a substitute for SDGs reform. I think there is a lot more discussions over climate change than probably about certain aspects of SDGs. And some of my colleague panelists have already talked about figures, but and I also wanted to mention some of the figures. And basically what we find when doing a little of a research there is that per year it requires $5 to $6 trillion to meet SDG agenda, which I think roughly corresponds to Mr. Koroshi's figures or Mr. Ghanem's figures. And it really sounds as enormous money. Obviously, it sounds enormous money, including 2.4 trillion for the global south, mostly developing or least developed countries. But it doesn't necessarily have to be so. Given the size of the world economy, given the structure of undergoing or intended investments, maybe it's not so sizable and not reachable, because we're talking here about 5 to 6% of world GDP. And in case of the developing or least developed countries, we're talking about 2% of GDP. So it's not that it's not achievable, and it's not that money doesn't exist. It's how we bring it all together. And I fully agree with what has also been said about less developed countries doing more on their side, because we are all aware that more can be done, for example, in improving the tax collection in some of the countries, or the quality investments. But it also, we are all aware, it also has to do with the quality of political systems in those countries to make, for example, for some of the reforms. And I'd like to remind you that Addis Ababa Action Agenda talks about official development assistance going into helping countries be more effective in tax collection, creating their own pool of resources, not to be fully dependable on other countries' willingness to transfer money for their financing needs. I think if we go back and to the recent Paris Agreement stocktake, which took place in the United Arab Emirates, it put 2050, if I read it properly, as a goal year for the net zero world, which in a way is already an implicit, for example, change of policy accepted by countries like, let's say, China, which is currently the largest emissioner, largest polluter, largest emission sending country, which until now has had 2060 as the net zero goal. So it seems that they've reflected already some of the things that are going on, for example, in that country. If I think I read somewhere the figure of incredible amounts of investments in renewables for the next 10 years, the capacity of renewable capacity installed, new capacity in China will actually match the total energy capacity installed in Europe today. From all the sources. So there's amazing movement in terms of green transition investments, and it's also happening in India. It's also happening in some other countries. So obviously the former thinking about when emissions will peak seem to be pushed up front, and it is estimated that now emissions will peak later this decade, not like 2040 or something like that, which also doesn't solve fully the problem of keeping the climate targets under around 1.5 degrees Celsius, because it also means that we need to take or remove a lot of carbon from the air, from the atmosphere, and that's, for example, the field where governments are relatively weak in whatever they want to do, and it looks like innovation overwhelmingly comes from the private sector, R&D. So we already see some oil companies, oil drillers, which probably are trying to seek new legitimacy for whatever they're doing by investing in carbon capture and storage, by investing in the mechanisms to take the carbon out from the air and so on, to probably extend their life beyond 2050, 2060. And so that's a very interesting, I think, movement. And you know, there are always people who are, you know, climate puritanists who say, no, it has to end, fossil fuel has to go away. But okay, being realistic, it probably takes a certain transition, and we'll probably see more funds going into that direction in years to come. So when we talk about 5 to 6% global spending in this field, we talk about public funds, but we also talk about a lot of private investments and so on. In the ideal world, I think both the IMF and World Bank should reflect the changing economic prospects and should fully reflect the economic changes of the world. And probably those two institutions should be able to revisit that every, let's say, 10 years, because the economic power of certain countries obviously change. But that also, I think, could open the door for, because we agree that neither of those institutions is powerful enough to solve every problem, to provide funding for everything and so on. So I would be, you know, happier to see IMF turning into global professional governance institution, World Economic Governance Institution, supporting UN and G20, whereas World Bank leading the efforts of coordinating development. And I think some steps of that direction could already be seen in Marrakesh, where World Bank signed an understanding agreement with other multilateral development banks into coordinating efforts to bring on fresh lending facility of about 300 to 400 billion for the next, let's say, 10 years, which adds to multilateral development banks' potential another 30 to 40 billion per year, from 100 to 100, let's say 30, 40, which is obviously still not enough. So what to do next? And I'd like to actually build on what has already been said by both previous panelists, because you know, I think that maybe this is very utopian, but I think the time for that will inevitably come, because we need to figure out the way how to blend public money with private money. And bondholders are obviously important players in that game. So I think the world also needs a kind of a Hamiltonian moment, if you see what I mean. And I think the recent experience of the European Union to create next generation facility to support post-COVID-19 recovery by EU being able to borrow. It was a big debate several years ago. I think when Werner was chancellor, that was probably impossible to even utter it, not to discuss. But now it's possible. Oh, it was possible a few years back, and it's bringing benefits to all the member states. So something like that is probably needed at the global scale, where private funds, UN, G20 can work to find a way how to provide for some innovative mechanism of probably issuing some global bonds to support development of the global south or other needs when it comes not only to climate change, adjustment, mitigation, but also other SDGs. Because when you go deeper into the green bonds, for example, mechanism, it is green because you want to take money to pursue some green goals. But there's got to be someone to say, yes, you've really done it. It's not greenwashing. You've really done it. And then you deserve, I don't know, extended maturity or lower interest rate or whatever. So something like that should, I think, be thought about. And for example, when talking about my part of the world and countries like Montenegro and other countries from the region of the Western Balkans who are EU member aspirant, I've been arguing for the tweak in the process because we are all entitled for some for certain preparatory funds, like which is called Instrument for Pre-Accession (IPA). So by tweaking the use of the IPA and actually blending that with, for example, green bonds mechanism, it could bring about more funds. It could make countries more responsible in pursuing SDG or green agenda, because in the compatibility of EU agenda and SDGs is quite high. So I think up to 70% or even more, despite the fact that SDGs are probably more results oriented in terms of the real life, and EU is more regulatory changes, but still it's very compatible. It can bring about not only fresh investments, it can bring about that sustainability, which is also important aspect. So it can be used as a kind of a leverage. So that works for countries that aspire to join EU, but it doesn't work for other countries. And for other countries, SDG agenda, the role of UNDP, for example, ODA and so on, is very important. But I think the same formula can probably be used. Where, for example, European Union is probably different kind of a beast, but African Union can also play an important role in the process, and other, along with multilateral development banks and so on. So I'd like to stop here because I think we've already touched upon a lot of probably compatible remarks. As I said, all the interventions have been very inspirational. So we could go like this on and on, but but let's focus. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights, but also your ideas. We now come to Agi Beres. Please, you have the floor. Zlatko has arrived. I'm sorry. Latecomers first.
Thank you so much. Well, the most important thing is that I finally arrived. I mean, that's the good part of it. The bad part is I'm late, but it's a logistic issue anyway. So I'm very glad to see such a good friends, those faces in here that I go from Vaira, over Amren. I don't want to go long because I will use my time naming the people who I'm so happy to see. Anyway, since we are talking about overall title is the future of multilateralism and the summit of the future and the need for a new global pact for international cooperation. Every time we speak about issues like that are related with SDGs, at least I'm the one that I'm participating in. The problem is how to pay for it. We look like a very good people who want so nice, who have holistic plan, how to do everything, how to tackle everything. But at the end of the day, the question is who's going to pay and how to pay it. So I understood that this session is about that. In here, you don't see nothing. You have just nice colors in here. You have green color, red color, and yellow color. This is the progress report on SDGs. This smallest green color is actually the color that says where we are on the track. This yellow color, which is a little bit bigger, says moderately or severely off the track. And then the red color is the color saying stagnation or regression, okay? And there's the gray color. Don't be so happy about gray color because gray color says we have no data. So basically speaking, if you take a look at this, you will see that we are on a halfway to 2030, and we are on a halfway to 2030, 15% of the goals are on track. 15% of the goals are green. 48% of the goals are moderately or severely off the track. And 37% stagnation or regression. And everyone, when we talk about this, people are saying, well, we have good plan, we have excellent SDGs, we are good intended people, but we cannot finance it. What a problem is that we are witnessing every day, again and again, that it's not only a lack of financing, but it's a big gap, and gap is widening in between developed world and developing world. When you take just some projections about what will be the workforce in next 20, 25 years, we can see that India is going to go from 928 million working population to 1.111 billion, which is 183 million people more in India. In China, it's almost the same number, but minus 180 million people will be working force in China by 2050. And when it comes to Europe, we are a little bit better than China, only minus 150 million working population by 2050. North America and Latin America together, they are going together higher for about 80 million. So when you put those numbers together, you see that India and China are 0. Europe and Americas are also 0. Someone is plus, someone is minus. But Africa, what's happening with Africa? Africa 2020 working population is 750 million people. And projection is that there will be additional 796 million people in Africa. So the point is, my point is very simple. Out of overall upgrading number of working population in the world, practically everyone will be in Africa, which leads me to the conclusion that this gap in between developing countries and developed countries, in a sense of financing everything, is going to be more and more severe. For the second year in a row, the world is no longer making progress in SDGs, to be very precise. That metrics that is established, 17 goals, 169 targets, 243 indicators are already slowing achieve SDGs, and by 2030, average index is going down. The average SDG index slightly declined in 2022, partly to the slow, non-existing recovery in poor and vulnerable countries. Again, poor and vulnerable countries are the ones that are actually more in bigger jeopardized. Performance on SDG 1, no poverty, and SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, remains below pre-pandemic levels in many low-income countries and low middle-income countries as well. This is a major setback, especially considering that before the pandemic, over the period of 2015 to 2020, the world was progressing in SDGs at rate of 0.5% per year, which was also too slow to reach 2030 goals that we have. And poorer countries are making greater gains than rich countries when it comes to negative trend. Progress in climate and biodiversity goals are also too slow, and especially to rich countries. Especially to rich countries when it comes to biodiversity. So, according to Chronicle on the Financing of Sustainable Development is more than evident. According to IMF, low-income countries constitute 8.5% of the world population, but currently account less than 1% of the world investment spending. Lower middle-income countries, that are almost half of the population, like 43% of the world, accounts only 15% of investment spending. And that's not sustainable. High-income countries, in contrast, account 15.8% of the world's population and account about half of the world investment spending. And the gap is widening. Low-income countries and lower middle-income countries make the poor half of the world combined, they equal 51% of the population, but account only 15% of the world investment. And of course, same discrepancy is found regarding fiscal outlays. Low-income countries and low middle-income countries together account around 10% of the world fiscal outlays, half of global population, while another one account for 90% of fiscal outlays. Annual average fiscal outlay spending per person in a low-income country is $133, not enough to provide universal schooling and much less to meet even that SDG. Having said so, there's 6 practical pathways for increased SDG finance I just want to share with you. First one, unfortunately, is increased domestic tax revenues. And I'll say a few words about it. It's easy to say, but I say a few words about it. Second thing is increased sovereign government borrowing from international development financial institutions. There are no healing without international financial institutions doing something severely different. Third, increased sovereign borrowing from international private capital markets, because there's an enormous room of opportunity there as well. Increased official development assistance, I'll say a few words about it. And of course, debt restructuring. Debt restructuring is more than evident. for heavily indebted borrowers, mainly to the lengthen maturities and reduce interest rates. And finally, we have to rely on people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, who are philanthropists. We should ask them to give more. If they don't want to give more, then we should make some kind of tax on the wealth, which is something which is debated very often, and even they are not complaining. Even Warren Buffett is not complaining about it. When we talk about increased domestic tax revenues, SDGs require large-scale public investment in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure, especially in green energy, digital access, water and sanitation, and environmental conservation. On the top of that, government has ongoing obligations for social protections, public administration, and other public services. So the level of investment needed per year are far greater than current revenues solicited by developing countries. Typical low-income country collects 15 to 20% of its GDP in revenues. But SDG public investment needs can reach at least 40% of GDP, or even higher. And public administration adds another 5 to 10% of GDP to budget needs. So when we want to say to the developing countries that we have to ease them with the debts, we have to give them more sovereign borrowing, and by private capital, we have to increase international development financial institution support, we need ODA, we have to tell them, you have to also do something yourself, which is actually increase a little bit upgrade your taxation system, at least a bit, and there's enough room of opportunity to do. As a rule of thumb, low-income countries should be aimed to at least 20% of GDP in government revenues, low middle-income countries for at least 30%, and upper middle-income class countries at least 35%. Of course, high-income countries, they can reach 40% of the, in order to, let's say, make that gap a little bit more fair. When it comes to, I just give you a few policy conclusions that I think that developing countries should take on much larger debts that is now considered normal, but to do so, they need to be able to borrow long-term and reasonable interest rates. That's not the case right now. And Ismail has a big speech about that. I'm sure that he will find a time, at least over lunch, to discuss that privately. And IMF and credit rating agencies need to rethink the current rating system, because current rating system is actually also kind of old-fashioned, let's put it that way. And debt sustainability indicators to take the future economic growth prospects of developing countries into account, thereby revealing a much larger debt servicing capacity than it is shown in statistics analysis that are very gray. Developing countries need to manage their budgets, trade policies, liquidity assets, so that they can routinely service an external debt, but that requires improved credibility and liquidity management for those type of countries. When it comes to increase ODA, I just want to say that donors countries of OECD are supposed to give 0.7% of GNI in ODA, but 2022 they gave only 0.33%. So, which is about 175.9 billions ODA. OECD countries, I'm talking about only them, but reaching 0.7 target, ODA would raise by at least $200 million per year. It's not enough, but it should show that big countries are also interested in doing such as this, so something like it. The potential new sources are apparent. The first would be a levy on high-income countries and EU upper middle-income countries, on annual carbon dioxide, CO2 emission. A levy of US $5 per ton of CO2 is the starting figure on high-income countries and upper middle-income countries, and that would give additional revenue in the area of $100 billion, which is, to be more precise, more than half of what they're giving today, developed countries to this idea. The second would be globally coordinated wealth tax on ultra-high net worth individuals. I mentioned Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos, so I'm now being precise in the sense of sentence that says something has to be done in that sense. So the world's 3,000 or so billionaires have combined net worth around $15 trillion. $15 trillion, let's say 2% wealth tax, assuming no leakage, will generate an additional 300 billion a year. which is significant amount of money. Anyway, and to make a long story short, I think in particular, the reform of global financing architecture should have some objectives. I'll put just a few of them. First one, greatly increased funding available to governments and private businesses in the emerging economies, especially to low-income countries and lower middle-income countries to carry out needed investments. Second, revision of the credit rating system and debt sustainability metrics to facilitate long-term sustainable development. Third thing is revision of the liquidity structure for low income and lower middle income class, especially regarding sovereign debt to forceful self-fulfilling banking and balance of payment crisis. Fourth is creation of ambitious and international agreed upon criteria for sustainable finance that are mandatory for all public financial institutions from the high level income countries over middle income countries to low income countries. And finally, alignment of private business investment, which Igor was talking very much about it, and he knows much more than me about it. I won't say anything about it no more. And last point, reform of current institutional framework and development of a new and innovative mechanism to improve the quality and speed of deployment of international cooperation. I remember a few years ago, Ismail was giving us one lecture and saying there is a businessman with a suitcase sitting on a tree and having a cutting off the tree where he's sitting. And I remember that picture had the title, "No More Business as Usual," right? So, I mean, when it comes to financing, if we keep with business as usual, we'll simply be like preachers who have no followers. Thank you.
Thank you for this professorial speech. Be a professor and a politician is an excellent mixture, and diplomat. So we will certainly come back on some issues of it. We said 15 minutes. We are well on track. I will give now the floor to Ari Veres. Not to justify certain trends of NGIC to become more gender balanced, but she is the real representative of UNDP in Geneva.
Yes, thank you very much. And I am no politician and no professor. I'm a development professional. So I will try to share with you kind of our experience from UNDP's perspective, working on these issues really in 170 countries. Because I very much agree that we need kind of a global approach, whether it's a new institution, it's new global policies, new global governance, but it is the global approach that's needed. And while we have a lot of success in some of these areas and we see progress in many developing countries, it's not at scale and it's not systemic. So just going back to what some of the distinguished speakers were talking about, yes, we are behind on the SDGs. And partially it is because we are behind on finance. And it's not about not having enough finances around the world. We have a global wealth of about 450 trillion, and my colleagues here quoted many numbers of what we need. You know, we estimate about 3 trillion per year for the SDGs, not considering China. So the funding is there, but the problem is that this is, even though finance is working already for development, just too often the wrong kind. It's not going the right places, and it's not going for the right issues. So we end up with an economic growth at any cost, at any processes, because that's what's available and that's what we know. We just know about growth, despite the fact that we have been discussing for decades that we shouldn't measure growth shouldn't measure development in GDP terms. What we end up with then is that the worth and the growth that we get, which is fossil fuel driven, community-based, debt fueled, and frequently unjust. That's what we have today. So how do we use finance to move away from this towards a development that we actually want and need as a global society, to expand the human and planetary well-being that actually the SDGs were aspiring to, create jobs, accelerate energy transitions, all at the same time. So from our perspective, when we're talking about financing, we're talking about financing this transition, not necessarily mobilizing new funding, but aligning this financing. So why is it not aligned? Because we're trying to tweak a system. We're trying to tweak a system that was set up many years ago in a completely different context, when we did not talk about climate change, we didn't talk about gender equality. All of these issues were not on the table. So the current financial institutions we have and the global financial architecture that you refer to is not suited for purpose for the issues that we are trying to tackle today. We are within a transformative agenda, but we're trying to do it with outdated policies, regulations, institutions, and a completely different set of investment incentives for the private sector that we're trying to achieve. So I think, you know, all of you alluded to this, but I think this is the big picture that we are trying to achieve. And just a few other numbers in addition to what you all mentioned already. Where is this money? Where is the wealth of the world? The richest 10% of the global population takes 52% of the global income, while the poorest half of the population earns 8.5% of it. So we can see the socioeconomic inequalities are significant, and the global income and wealth inequalities are also equally significant. And these translate into the climate inequalities as well, in terms of who is contributing and trying to offset them. And I just want to bring in another kind of issue that maybe goes back to the opening session and wasn't so much mentioned, but I think what we also see is some of the problem is that when we're trying to advance on some of these policies, energy transition, climate actions, actually the short-termism is it's not only the short-termism of politicians that's the problem, and many of you have much more experience with that than myself, but actually because who is carrying the costs of these investments? A lot of the times it's the poor of these countries. So societies are pushing back on the exact policies that it's in the best interest of societies. They are pushing back because they are carrying the cost. So that makes politicians backpedal, and we have seen it also in Europe, how backpedaling on some of the climate policies is also happening. So the point of this is that we cannot address climate without addressing the social issues. We cannot advance the SDGs without really looking at the economic, socio-economic issues together and ensure that those policies are going hand in hand. So that makes it extremely complex, and that's why there's so many gray areas and the lack of information, as Csaba, you also said, because the complexity of these issues and the intertwined nature of the various issues is overwhelming in terms of tracking from a data perspective. I wanted to talk a bit about debt, but I think many of you refer to that. So I think we all agree that the debt crisis is part of the problem. And on average, low-income countries spend about 2.3% more on debt servicing than on their social services. So with that kind of alignment of their finances, it's extremely difficult to put the right incentives. And there are many other numbers that we can quote. So what can we do? So what's the ambition here? And that's where I want to pick up from some of that you were mentioning on your 6 points, because we do have good examples, we do have good policies, and we do have progress in many countries. But how can we make that more systemic? So what we are saying is that we need to do 3 things, actually. We need to align financing. We need to also change the quality of financing and the quality of investments that you mentioned. But that also means that we need to help developing countries, especially with capacities, to be able to do that. There's simply just a lot of capacity gap in terms of how to bring this transition about. So on the first point, aligning national financing, I want to talk a little bit about what does it specifically mean and how we can do that, because I think we really need to go towards that. We all agree on the problem, but what is the solution? And what is that we need to do differently just from tweaking the existing systems? So, I mean, I think, as Csaba, you said very eloquently, it's not about an additional financing for SDGs. It's not about an additional financing for climate or gender or other issues. It's about managing a public budget and the public policies that incentivize private investments that would align the existing budgets towards these issues. So that's what we are working on as UNDP with many other partners like the World Bank in most of the developing countries on the so-called integrated national financing frameworks. This is underway in 86 countries. And we have seen really significant shifts based on this. So essentially, it's looking at how public financing is aligned with the national development, the national translation of the SDGs. So looking at the localized goals and the localized targets, what is a budget looking like aligned to that? and what are financing policies within the country, both public and private financing policies look like if they want to have that particular outcome, whether it's on climate, health, or whatever is the context of the country. So this is really a support to a process of planning and policy reform, and we have already 250 reforms in these countries that are really bringing by some results. So to me, this is number one, because without proper financing policies at the national level, I mean, we can have the ambition of a global level, but that's really ambitious. So if we can have that at the national level, we're already going somewhere. Now, of course, you can say part of the problem is if you look around the world and referring back to the conflicts that were mentioned at the opening, is that actually governance failures are a big problem for this. This works where there's some form of governance, whether it's democratic or good or whatever adjective we use for that, that's a different question. But we have many places where actually governance failures do not allow to do that. So what do we do in places like that? And by the way, this goes back to a little bit your ODA numbers. Nobody mentioned that, but out of all of that ODA, there is an enormous shift going towards humanitarian assistance versus development assistance. So that further pushes the funding available for as kind of seed money and investments into attracting more. A second, and there's many more we can do in this alignment of finance, but I wanted to emphasize the role of the ownership of global public goods as can only be done by governments. The second is trying to look at how we can mobilize new types of finances and how we can have new instruments. And there are a lot of innovative financing instruments. This links to your point about debt and debt exchange or debt swaps, debt restructuring. There are lots of good examples of issuance of new types of bonds, sustainability bonds, that are trying to go away from the current debt with its financial numbers, but also in terms of the content of the quality of what are these debts financing and how these bonds are contributing to the sustainable development goals. There are many examples in Honduras, Bolivia, Bangladesh. We work with in Uzbekistan on some of these sustainability bonds. Uruguay has very good examples. So it's there. But on the grand scheme of things right now, it's relatively insignificant if you look at the entirety of the financing required. And we need to look at more of these instruments. We cannot resolve the problems we have the same old way because those obviously did not result in a change. So we need to look at new instruments, new financial modalities. And just to give you another example, we're also working on insurance risk financing. I mentioned the investments going in humanitarian assistance and response to crises, natural disasters. If you look in developing countries, almost none of this is insured. A very small percent of it is insured. So we can also look at very innovative new ways of looking at insurance that can be brought in, offsetting the humanitarian response and the humanitarian financing that's needed. The third area is about how do we then bring in the private sector. The private sector obviously would like to make profit, while there's a lot of incentives coming from the demand of consumers, but at the end of the day, they want to make profit. And working in Switzerland and working in Europe, I think it's very clear that this financing we're talking about a lot of it is in developed countries, and the need is in developing countries. So when we're talking about globally, how do we bridge this gap? And one of the main obstacles why the financing is not going to the places where it's needed, because the investors are not seeing the profitable and risk-free pipeline. Any investor, large investor you're looking at in the private finance sector, their first question is, where is the pipeline? What is the risk? What is the return on investment? And the market is not going to invest in that information and remove that barrier for investment. So this is some of the things that, for example, the multilateral systems like UNDP, UN agencies, and other governments can invest in, is remove the market barriers for the proper flow of financing from the investors to the investees. And just to give you again a couple of examples that are already working, and we really see that can be scaled up. One is the so-called SDG investor maps. We're working with countries to develop an investor landscape that allows the investors to remove a little bit of a risk and provide the kind of market information that they lack. And these investor maps are not just about financial information, but where these countries need investment. So for example, in Armenia, if one of the main goals is to improve health services and telehealth services, then this sector is obviously something that could attract investments. So we are working at the national and the local level to see how can we provide this as a global public good, an information that helps really channel the investments to the right places. Then lastly, in this, very concrete kind of suggestions of where we can focus, going back to the point of the lack of data, lack of standards, and also to some of the financial instruments. Part of the problem is that we don't have the data because we don't have standards to measure. So when we're talking about even green bonds or a green bank, I'm just wondering what is the global measurement that you're all referring to when you're talking about the impact of these investments? How do we know that the net impact of such investment is actually creating sustainability? And one of the things that we are working on is really to promote these kinds of global standards. So the SDGs impact standards that will make it comparable, that will make it measurable in terms of how these investments are generating transformation and impact on the different sustainability elements. And we're also working with ISO because it's quite important that we can make it globally recognized and understandable standards that that everybody can refer to. So, I think in just overall, because I need to wrap up, I want to leave you maybe with 3 numbers that goes back a little bit to the speakers before me. Just 3, 2, 1. So if you all agree that more or less we need 3 trillion annual investment for the SDGs and climate goals in developing countries outside of China, then what we are looking for is how we can have 2 trillion of this from domestic resource mobilization, which goes back to the taxation issue, which goes back on aligning on your budget planning processes, and 1 trillion additional financing through official development assistance and private capital markets, which goes back on the incentives of how do we incentivize the private sector, how do we provide standards, new financial instruments that would give that 1 million. So we hope to go for this 3, 2, 1 transformational results over the duration of the rest of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for your eloquent speech and taking also into consideration what you already heard from your partners at the table here. Now we come and we thank former Chancellor Feynman for his patience to wait and for his presentation. We all are eager to give you our ears, as they say in Africa.
Thank you very much. I think it was an interesting discussion, and I will come back to the opening remarks. During conflict in Ukraine and Gaza, it will be very difficult to reach a goal on an international level, as you all know, and as you all mentioned. But I only want to take it again in mind. If you need now a conference to implement something on the World Bank level or in a Green Bank or something, and you need to meet US, Russia, China, at this time, it is nearly impossible to find on a short-term solution. So I think this conflict costs a lot also for our goals, humanitarian losses and all the we can hear every day. But the second thing is that you have the expenses of military service. And nobody mentioned it today, but I'm not aware of the figures. There are so many experts of figures, yes. But I'm sure that the figures of military expenses in Europe, in Russia, in China, in India, in US will increase rapidly. And I think as long as these military expenses will increase, for me, it is not possible to increase expenses on this level and on the other and on the third and on the fourth, because if you have a plan, you need priorities. And at the moment, I have the feeling that the military expenses are the priority for many countries, many politicians, many parliamentarian, many public discussions, etc. So it's a wrong priority. For me, I would like a priority for a financial concept to finance all these measures we discuss, we agree on, and the social and the climate measures need this finance plan. And I can also fully understand what Korosi said, because I was 8 years a member of the European Council. And I can tell you that if it started with a huge plan, but no methodology and no financial plan, you never found a result. And it is not because the people are not visionary enough, or their heart is not on the right side in their body for the right goals. It's because without a financial plan, you cannot step ahead. So I will say something about the positive side. This 15%, I think these best practice models are interesting. How was it possible without the financial plan, without enough financial resources to fulfill 15 or 20% of the plan? I think these best practice examples should come to the stage before the curtain, because I think this is very interesting. And so I tried to figure out, so I'm sorry that I don't want to repeat everything, because I fully agree with nearly everything what you said. I would like to figure out the second thing. What is possible on a national or regional level? And I'm sorry to discuss about Europe, because I know Europe, my political experience. And I can tell you, it is a tough time, because you have all the consequences of the Ukraine war. That means energy prices increased. That means competitiveness of industry, especially of German industry, is not so easy with high energy prices. And with a trade, a free trade in the world, competitiveness is, you cannot say we have this product with more green technologies or with more, with better technologies, because at the end, the consumer looks at the price. And so this is difficult. The other thing is that the inflation rate, because of these high energy prices and because of this conflict, is so increasing, was increased the last years. Now it's a little bit better, but that means that the interest rates increased. And if interest rates increase and you are responsible as a minister for finance, I think some of you have friends there or have been in this position, you must be a little bit worried, because higher interest rates mean that your debt, not in the first step, because regularly you have time, 2, 3, 5 years until you need to finance it again. But a finance minister seemed a little bit worried about the idea to have this level of interest rates. So you can see the effect of this conflict is, it affected more than I think, or I also expected in the first step, and for a longer term. So how can we do something on a regional level at these difficult circumstances? And so I'm also in favor, for example, of taxes. And this is not typical for me, because I won an election because I didn't raise the taxes for small and middle-sized companies, because they pay a lot of taxes. And this was one of my issues in my first election campaign. And I fully agree that there are many people who pay a lot of taxes, and always to say we raise taxes is not a really good concept. But I will give you another example for taxes where they can make sense. The air traffic. If you book a ticket in Vienna to go to Munich, it is more expensive to go by train than to find a cheap flight. And this cannot really be the sense, because we know that all this transformation to clear energies and the weather is train under 1,000 kilometers is one of the real alternatives to huge vessels with all the problems, to all the airplanes and the air traffic. And so, for example, if we cannot agree on a European level and later on an international level to tax it, you will not really change the situation, because the consumer and the people who like to travel likes it to pay 30 euros for a ticket. And then and you will also, for the transport, you will not be compatible. I was only 18 months responsible for the train, for the way, for the railway. But I remember exactly that the transport is daily an issue. How much is the cost with the vessel? How much are costs with the plane, and what's the cost for the train? And if you don't have this, I call it now taxes, because I know there are also tolls and fees and other instruments. Yeah, it's not always taxes, general taxes. But if you don't have something to interfere and to make a framework where things you want to promote and support has also an economic reason why it works, only the speeches and only the moral and all the media and all the public is not enough. The better way to reach a goal for me is to think about Jean-Claude Juncker, many other commissioners did a lot of proposals. How can we do some more financing to organize what we really want to reach? And so, and I don't want to be too long, but the second thing is there is a lot of tax fraud in the world. Many people, many friends of me, entrepreneurs, say tax avoiding. It is a nice word, tax avoiding. And if you compare what a small and middle-sized company pays taxes and what Amazon pays taxes, or other companies on this international level, I think there is room for maneuver to say we can get more public money. Because what I recognized in the discussion today is, for example, that we try to think about bondholders who have now high interest rates for their bonds, but a high risk. And we say we reduce the interest rates. And so we give them more room to maneuver. But we have on the other side to shift part of the risks from the private bondholders to the public. So there is always the public and the public sector and who takes these risks at the end. And if you take all these risks and you have ever been responsible in a government or in a European Council or UN or in such responsible situations, you must think about how can you have more resources, financial resources, to take all these risks. It sounds easy to say, okay, we take the risk from the private and take it to the public, and then the debt goes down, and it's better for developing countries. Yeah, everybody understands it. It's simple and it's explained in 2 minutes. But you need, on the other side, to think about the financial architecture, where you also get taxes and parts of the profits in the world. I'm in favor of profits. I admire companies who earn millions and billions and trillions, and everything is okay. But we need the share, not only from the small and middle-sized companies. We need also a fair share of these profits, I think, to fulfill the approach we discussed together, and to fulfill at the end the need to have enough money also for the public sector. Because I never met a prime minister, a chancellor, or a president who said, my budget has a lot of room, and now I think about doing the best for the additional opportunities. I only know prime ministers and finance ministers who say now, who very complicated, everything is together, and that crisis and this crisis and Corona crisis and the last crisis, banking crisis and so crisis. And so I think we need also a little bit more on framework and for a new financial architecture. So thank you very much for having the chance to discuss a little bit of my experience in the European Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chancellor. I am extremely sorry, Ismail, but we do not have time for discussion. We would have a fantastic panel here to offer this, but time is of the essence. So let me not summarize, but maybe complement some aspects. First, you are completely right with the so-called beauty contest going on in DAC. To have this sum of 0.07% for poverty alleviation, and it always increases. Now all the military assistance, military spending, migration, climate money, all these kind of expenditures are calculated and reduced. So, and nobody's intervening in this shaming and blaming. No university even does develop a kind of an indicator to make those things public. This is really making me angry because we discuss it since 30 years. And national parliaments even go to Paris to control whether you indicated the proper possibilities or not. And the whole movement in '88 was led by a big country over the ocean. They started with military expenditures and military assistance to developing countries to undermine that goal in DAC Paris. Second, I think we should go beyond this mechanical solidarity. We should give solidarity a new value, impetus, because it needs to convince people. It needs to convince those members of parliament who really want to come on. And then maybe we should reflect on the architecture of accountability. Who is accountable for what to whom? And this needs more reflections. And there are different partners in the whole context of aligning finances, but we need to discuss that in order to convince the taxpayers, the parliaments, the different factions of parties in order to do so. And the next point would be what deals for investors? I once was in a committee of the Bank of Liechtenstein for looking at 107 investment funds for so-called social investments in developing countries. Only 5 did invest there. The others did invest in industrialized countries. And they all pretended the lack of deal. When I called the so-called climate funds, I said, what are your major problems? The first answer was, we lack good deals. When you talk to investment funds and ask them for more green investments, and said, bring us proposals, but not just ideas, but proposals and deals to invest into. So there is a lot of capacity building and a lot of other things going on. Then on national levels, I think we also should not forget risk governance. And governance means risk management, not just risk analysis. And there are only a few countries having risk managers at the Prime Minister's office or the President's office. Then what I did not hear today was differentiating between input-output on one side, which is common for financial investors, but about the validation of outcome, the indirect consequences of certain investments. which might rank high. When I chaired the Global Crop Diversity Trust, we collected money to finance Spitsbergen and all these seed banks. The major, even Bill Gates himself or others said, if you bring me standards that I can put it in my accounts as an investment, then I will do it. Then I tried to develop standards with KPMG, but unfortunately my colleague there that passed away. But there are standards needed in order to justify for the so-called responsibles in the trade, in the management, in the investment funds, in order to invest money and to validate also outcome and not just financial returns. And then last but not least, the auditing standards, for example, the ICRC from the humanitarian sector still needs to have about 32 different standards to their donor communities. So can you imagine, why is it not possible to develop common auditing standards in order to facilitate for the actors those investments, but also those various spending? You see, this subject is of utmost concern for all the actors involved, but parliaments, please don't forget that at the end, parliaments need to be convinced, people need to be convinced, and there are possibilities to do so. But please do not think to finance an army of consultants to measure what we tried to do, the Rio 2020 agenda, where there were hundreds of millions spent to finance consultants instead of pushing development bottom up and to give people a chance. At the end, what counts is the proximity of concerns. These people know their demands, what they need, and we should listen to them and not only to governments. Thank you very much, and sorry for being a little bit blunt. All the best and a good day.